Good evening. An Alabama congressman whom Guam delegate James Moylan has befriended appears to be pulling the military buildup rug from under Guam and the CNMI's not-so-watchful eyes, as southeastern pork barrel Republicans profit off the high cost of groceries, fuel, and commodities in the Mariana Islands. And in a stunning admission, the Republican Moylan, who portrays himself as a defense hawk and supporter of military investments into Guam, said he gave his stamp of approval to a shoveling out of defense spending from this part of the world and onto the pork barrel heaps in Alabama, Mississippi, and Hawaii, making this a not in my backyard position not seen since the A-76 study of the 1990s. The U.S. military wants to build the defenses needed to meet threats and potential threats from China in its two U.S. strongholds closest to China, Guam and the CNMI. The program, Pacific Deterrence Initiative, rolled out in March with a $9.1 billion budget request for next fiscal year. According to that request, the president and the military want that money spent in the Western Pacific Hemisphere. Quote, it consists of targeted investments that enhance U.S. force posture, infrastructure, presence, and readiness, as well as the capacity and capabilities of U.S. allies and partners, specifically in the Indo-Pacific region, primarily west of the international date line. End quote. This is according to the March 2023 submission by the Defense Department of an initial $9.1 billion budget for fiscal year 2024. PDI funding for the foreseeable future will be much greater than the first-year investment. According to a table of funding breakdown provided by the Office of U.S. Congressman Gregorio Sablan of the CNMI, the military plans to spend more than $34 billion in this region over the next 5 years. But pork barrel Republicans who control the U.S. House of Representatives appear to have other plans that will benefit their beleaguered hometowns at the expense of what once was considered foolproof economic buildup for the Mariana Islands. And the plot thickens. Mr. Moylan's new friends, whom he brought to Guam en route to a Taiwan junket, smiling for the cameras and all, are from the same group of pork barrel legislators who also benefit from the very Jones Act they protect at all costs. The same Jones Act that causes a $4 jar of mayonnaise in Alabama to cost a Mariana Islander $11. The U.S. Department of Defense has for years seen the threat from the People's Republic of China, quote, as its preeminent pacing challenge, according to a March 2023 budget submission for its response to this challenge, the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, or PDI. According to the report, quote, a great amount of the department's investments and efforts are focused on this threat and strengthening Indo-Pacific deterrence, end quote. Indeed, over the next 5 years, DoD plans to spend more than $34 billion in the western portion of the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command area of responsibility. Quote, it consists of targeted investments that enhance U.S. force posture, infrastructure, presence, and readiness, as well as the capacity and capabilities of U.S. allies and partners, specifically in the Indo-Pacific region, primarily west of the international date line, the report to Congress states. While Hawaii is part of Indo-PACOM, it is not west of the IDL. The first wave of that investment was anticipated to cost $9.1 billion for next fiscal year, an amount budgeted by the president, which appeared in both the U.S. House of Representatives and U.S. Senate versions of the nation's annual military spending authority legislation, the National Defense Authorization Act, or as it's commonly called, the NDAA. Quote, to sustain our military advantage over China, it makes major investments in integrated air and missile defenses and operational energy efficiency, as well as in our dominance, our maritime dominance, and in munitions, including hypersonics, U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin III stated in a March 13, 2023 news release about the budget request. Quote, he goes on, this budget includes the largest ever request for the Pacific Deterrence Initiative, which we are using to invest in advanced capabilities, new operational concepts, and more resilient force posture in the Indo-Pacific region, end quote. And to remove any question about Guam and the CNMI's potential share in this one-year, $9.1 billion investment to be followed by $25 billion through fiscal year 2028, one need only read the next sentence of his statement. Quote, it also enables groundbreaking posture initiatives in Guam, Mariana Islands, the Philippines, Japan, and Australia, end quote. Kilili, as the CNMI federal House delegate affectionately is known in the Marianas, did not hesitate to confirm his support of military investments throughout the Mariana Islands. While his Guam counterpart, Mr. Moylan, has also outwardly expressed this same belief for the island, his actions on the House Armed Services Committee regarding this particular program tell a different story. Tables detailing breakdowns of funding among the Army, Navy, to include the Marine Corps, Air Force, and Space Force are contained in the budget submission. Most of the entries are not location specific, though much of the planned investment are for operations, construction, maintenance, research, training, testing, and procurement of equipment and supplies for programs and force movements that match previously stated objectives of both Indo-PACOM and Joint Region Marianas for Guam, Tinian, and Saipan. Many of the budget entries are Guam specific. For example, part of a $667 million U.S. Air Force program calls for the construction of the North Aircraft Parking Ramp at Joint Region Marianas. Another $1.5 billion in military construction by the Navy will go specifically to Marine Corps bases in Australia and Guam, with sub-rows of construction projects in the hundreds of millions each. According to the report, $801 million alone will go to the development of the Missile Defense Agency on Guam, to include the $169 million procurement of major equipment, $385 million for a budget category called Guam Defense Development, and 7 other various budget subsets. It is described this way, quote, MDA activities in this category include funding to support MDA's contribution to development and integration of a joint missile defense system, or MDS, for the defense of Guam against ballistic, hypersonic, and cruise missile threats. This includes MDA partnering with the U.S. Army to fully mature the architecture to integrate Army and MDA elements within an on-island command center. The architecture acquisition process also provides environmental, engineering, and interoperability activities to balance costs and associated risks. The interdepartment partnership will plan appropriate flight tests to validate defense of Guam MDS capabilities. MDA will continue P&D efforts for military construction projects to support the Guam architecture and continue to develop and field a multi-faced distributed land-based Army-Navy transportable radar surveillance radar. MDA will also continue procuring vertical launch system and Aegis weapon system components needed to support the defense of Guam architecture, end quote. The breadth of these potential investments to Guam came as a surprise to the Guam Chamber of Commerce's 20-year-old Armed Forces Committee, which has been an invaluable advocate for defense spending on the island. Quote, how do you even spend that money? Chamber President Catherine Castro asked as she reviewed the table adding up to the $34 billion 5-year spending plan.
My final question, unless you guys wanted to add anything else, is so I'm not surprised that I was looking for with the $34 billion. I'm sort of wondering what's been running through your heads about the outlook of Guam's economy, just on face value.
Missile defense, big time.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking, how do you spend this money? And I mean, it's just an incredible amount. And I'm as somebody who lives on Guam, right? We think about, let's tread very carefully, right? Because as long as we have been having this discussion about the buildup and everything, and we've seen how it's progressed and it's come back, and it's progressed and it's come back, and when you look at it in retrospect, it's been good because it slowed things down. It offered opportunities for discussion. It offered opportunities for people to learn more about how Guam is going to be affected and how our nation is going to be affected and how the entire region is going to be impacted by these investments in our region and in our islands. So this additional funding is, opens up like an oh my gosh moment, and it'll be very interesting. I'm extremely curious how much of this money is allocated for Guam specifically, and so I would love to hear back from you and see how they respond to you.
I wish the congressman would have said something. That's a quote from AFC member, Chamber past president, and longtime businessman and newspaper publisher Lee Weber, referring to the fact that Jim Moylan has never publicly discussed this budget proposal. Mr. Weber is a combat Marine, having served our country in the Vietnam War. Why didn't Mr. Moylan ever mention the scope of the military's possible spending plan to his constituents back home? He has constantly boasted about his position on the House Armed Services Committee, one which he credits to his close relationship with House Republicans, especially its HASC chairman, Alabama Representative Mike Rogers. On July 14, Mr. Rogers trumpeted the House's passage of its version of the NDAA, saying, quote, "The threat we face from China is the most pressing national security threat we've faced in decades. The FY24 NDAA is laser focused on countering China. The FY24 NDAA protects our homeland from these threats by investing in a stronger missile defense and modernizing our nuclear deterrent. The legislation also boosts innovation and revitalizes the industrial base to ensure they can deliver the systems we need to prevail in any conflict," end quote. That's his statement. That was his statement. The next sentence in the statement from the Alabama congressman could pass as a staple of politics. It says, quote, "The FY24 NDAA also recognizes the critical role Alabama plays in our national defense and strengthens the role for years to come," end quote. Until you read what the HASC, specifically Mr. Rogers, added to the NDAA. A tiny section of the NDAA appeared first in a July 3 markup draft by the HASC and is entitled "Assessment on Use of Certain Areas in Southeastern United States for Testing and Training in Support of Pacific Deterrence Initiative." It had the appearance of an oxymoron Kandit had to explore further. Why would Congress want to authorize expenditures in southeastern states near the Atlantic for testing and training needed in the Pacific? According to the new NDAA language, which passed the House but is not currently contained in the Senate version, this Section 366 commands the Secretary of Defense to augment assumptions for the PDI and include the southeastern United States in its area of application. Within 180 days of enactment of the NDAA, a timeline far shorter than deadlines the HASC has placed into the NDAA for other studies it demands, the House wants the Defense Secretary to identify, quote, "any test or training area located outside of the area of responsibility of the United States Indo-Pacific Command, and in particular in the southeastern region of the United States, with the potential to be used to expand the capacity and persistence of theater-level operations, including any such owned or operated by any federal department or agency, state, institution of higher education, or commercial entity," end quote. The language goes on to command the Defense Secretary to include analysis, identification, and assessment of varied ways to move funding from the multi-billion-dollar Pacific Deterrence Initiative outside the Indo-PACOM area of responsibility and to the other side of the globe, to Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. Guam's lone non-voting delegate to the House, the Mr. Moylan, who proudly sits on the HASC, says the addition to the NDAA language does not subtract anything from either Guam or the CNMI. In fact, Mr. Sablan, or Kalili of the CNMI, confirmed that the House increased PDI funding from the $9.1 billion the President requested to $9.7 billion. Quote, "Section 366 is additive and not subtractive and is intended to ultimately increase DoD's focus on Indo-PACOM, not detract from operations already conducted in the region," Moylan's communications director, Hannah Devanzo, said. Nothing in the NDAA, however, that the House passed states this. In fact, the Rogers addition to the NDAA broadly defines the political pivot from Indo-PACOM to the southeastern United States in terms of testing or training areas to be funded as including, quote, "any range or other facility that may be used by the Secretary of Defense for testing or training purposes," end quote. More startling than Mr. Moylan's unfounded assertion that Section 366 will not affect Guam or the CNMI's potential security and economic outlook is his outlook on the matter. According to Ms. Devanzo, quote, Congressman Moylan's position on and awareness of Section 366 of the NDAA is that it is a positive development for the PDI for three key reasons. First, this amendment allows the Department of Defense to conduct training that may otherwise pose harm to the people of Guam in safe geographies elsewhere in the nation. Second, at present, Pacific-facing jurisdictions such as Hawaii are the primary stakeholders in Indo-PACOM-related decisions. By expanding this to the southeast, this makes communities, such as HASC Chairman Rogers' home state of Alabama, more deeply invested in the success of Indo-PACOM, end quote. And then there's the clincher. Quote from Hannah Devanzo, the congressman did participate in the inclusion of this language into the NDAA and approved this language for the aforementioned reasons, end quote. Guam's own and lone delegate to Congress, a professed defense hawk and so-called supporter of the military buildup, put Guam's stamp of approval on a plan to move funding and resources away from the Indo-PACOM area of responsibility and send those resources to Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. This is by far the largest NIMBY a Guam delegate to the House has ever admitted to. The Guam Chamber Armed Forces Committee members had no idea this had happened. Neither did Joint Region Marianas, according to relevant sources. In fact, on a tour of training compound and firing ranges by the U.S. Marine Corps on Guam, Public Affairs Officer Major Diane Rosenfeld emphasized the importance of the facilities on Guam, not just for the Marines who will relocate to the island by the end of 2024, but for local law enforcement and for the nation's allies. And in the deterrence to an emerging China, those allies are all around Guam, not the southeast United States mainland. In fact, a great portion of the training schedule at these facilities will be dedicated to multinational exercises with America's allies, Ms. Rosenfeld said. It is a position echoed separately by Mark Sablon, also a member of the Chamber Armed Forces Committee and the senior executive for SPPC Guam, which operates 76 gas stations and Circle K convenience stores. His colleague, Mr. Weber, honed in on Guam's delegates' contention that some of the training that would be moved to places like Alabama would pose harm if that training happened on Guam. I don't quite get what would be safe for Alabama that wouldn't be safe for Guam, Mr. Weber said repeatedly throughout the interview with the Armed Forces Committee. Did he say what? No. Mr. Moylan did not respond to the follow-up question.
Between Hawaii, Guam, Japan, Korea, Philippines, Australia, wherever else we have military bases and military assets, right? Obviously, Palau and what that and what the deterrence initiative is to protect this entire region, right? And so it'd be interesting to hear what the Congress folks how they respond to your inquiry about, what sort of exercises that they are having in the southern states, and it would be very interesting, and it would also be interesting to see how this is divvied up, accordingly. Yeah.
I should inform you that last week when I brought this to the attention of JRM, they were just as surprised as anybody else. They weren't aware of this section. Yeah.
It's interesting.
So the southeastern United States. So you visited the urban training facility, right?
So cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the gentleman that gave us the tour, I forget his name, Baldwin, said that these are for the troops. And this place has been specifically selected because they need to learn how to fight in this type of environment.
Climate,
sweat, thick brush, humidity, you name it, rain,
Yeah.
as opposed to fighting in the woods. two different stories.
Yeah. And it has been mentioned to us that the military does need to relearn how to go to war in the Pacific, right? Because most of the, where they've been fighting has been very, very different. Afghanistan, the Middle East, and all that, those areas, right? And so relearning what it means to, to fight in a kinetic situation, right? They would have to learn how to do that. And so, again, that is a very, the opportunity for training, not only for the military, but even for our own law enforcement and the folks the allies in the area. That what a great facility that is going to be.
What kind of exercises Congress wants to have in the southern states, Ms. Castro, the Guam Chamber president, said. Ms. Rosenfeld giving Kandit a tour of the training and firing range facilities named every precaution, safety net, and system of compliance with military protocol and the National Environmental Protection Act as she explained wildlife mitigation and historic preservation amid the future training and firing range compounds. Scattered through those explanations were her passionate defenses of combat simulations, the climate, foliage, suburban designs, humidity, and other factors unique to this part of the world that will save lives in the battlefield. Quote, if they make a mistake here, she said as she took us through a building under construction that will act as a live fire training zone, we can dial in on that so that they're more prepared to make those mistakes in real life situation, end quote. And the moisture in the air, the natural sounds, and the sweat coming off of men and women wearing 60 pounds of gear, those are the details of the training simulation that help to prepare Marines for the difference between life and death in actual combat, she said.
60 pounds of gear, making the decision with a live round to shoot or not to shoot. Sweating. And using simulations is one thing, but when you actually have a live round, it takes your brain to a different level. Like when you're shooting with simulation, it's a little bit easier to say, oh, I should pull the trigger, I shouldn't pull the trigger, because at the end of the day, it's not going to do anything. In an environment like this, it's more critical because you deciding to pull that trigger is either an armed combatant, could be a family, it could be an elderly person sitting in a chair, so it feels that much more real. And all of this is it's training for the right tactics and procedures, and also training the mind to go through all of those things quicker, because the more you rehearse, the quicker your mind is working, and the more your mind can identify what's right, what's wrong, and what are the consequences if I do something or I don't do something.
How critical is it for not just a facility like this, but basically for the training, this entire training facility for the Indo-PACOM theater to be in this region?
I think anytime you can have an organized training location that is big enough to provide training to regimental size units, it makes a huge difference, because the whole training atmosphere here in Guam is set up to be the individual training. So we'll go to the live fire training range, where that's just individuals honing their basic weapons, their weapon skills. So every Marine or rifleman, that's where we do our training, because precision is everything. You can't come to a location like this if you don't know how to hit your target down there. So then this elevates the training a little bit, so you can do it as a unit. And you can do it together at the mount facility with, the squads, the platoons next to you as an integrated training. So you'll see the individual training at the live fire training range, and then you elevate it here where you're working in tandem with those people next to you. And then you asked about allies and partners. So individual, then you learn how to operate with that Marine to your left and your right. You learn to operate with bigger units as a Marine Corps. And then you bring in your allies and partners or joint services, Army, Air Force, and then you can integrate it all here. So it's huge. It's incredibly important for the individuals who are going to be trained, as well as the units that are going to be trained here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So what we like to call it muscle memory, So what the major was talking about, when you're coming into a room and having to make a split decision, rules of engagement come into play. And that's what you're learning in here is when, how quick you have to make that decision and making the right decision. And we're filming it, right? We're recording it, so we can play it back. Whether it's in here or over there with simunitions, we still can film it and show them what they're doing right and wrong before they come into play.
But in Mike Rogers' NDAA, those factors are secondary to his desire to take at least some of the PDI's projected $34 billion and train and test instead in a totally different theater. On May 24, Typhoon Mawar brought super typhoon strength winds and rains to the northern parts of Guam, which included Andersen Air Force Base and Marine Corps Base Camp Laz. The storm, the first of its kind in more than 20 years, knocked out the island's power system, which cascaded into the loss of running water for a few days. On June 9, Forbes made the unusual decision to publish prominently an article by senior contributor Craig Hooper entitled, "China Will Exploit Guam's Struggle to Recover from Typhoon Mawar." His lead, quote, "For military strategists, Guam's slow recovery from Typhoon Mawar is a real concern," end quote, differed substantially from statements made by the military itself. This is not to mention the fact that nowhere in the article does Mr. Cooper name those so-called military strategists. Quote, "Joint Region Marianas was not approached for comment by Mr. Craig Cooper or Forbes magazine," Joint Region Marianas Public Affairs Officer Lieutenant Commander Catherine Koenig confirmed. Quote, "The remote island hosts to several critical military facilities," Mr. Hooper goes on to state in his article, "is a linchpin for U.S. security in the Western Pacific. As a potential target for Chinese societal influencing, cyber attack, or military assault, Guam is doing a poor job of demonstrating it can support the island's 170,000 U.S. citizens during a crisis," end quote. The commander of Joint Region Marianas provided a different outlook though. Quote, "Typhoon Mawar swept through Guam indiscriminately," said Joint Region Commander Rear Admiral Greg Huffman. Quote, "Although we suffered damage both on and off our installations, I am proud of the teamwork and resiliency demonstrated by everyone throughout the island. Every time we take a hit, we learn and come back stronger. I am optimistic about our recovery process, and I believe that we are well postured for any future threat to Guam," end quote. Why the off-target hit on Guam and Forbes then? Consider the timing and the players. Within days of the publication, Guam delegate Moylan brought his celebrated buddy, House Armed Services Committee Chairman Mike Rogers, along with other members of the HASC to Guam en route to a Taiwan junket. According to the Marine Corps Camp Laz Protocol Office, Mr. Rogers did not visit the training or firing ranges despite their importance to the PDI and total defense posture. Then, days later, the HASC introduces Section 366 as a markup. Mr. Hooper is a former business development executive who handled congressional relations for the Navy ship manufacturer Austal USA, which is based in Alabama, the home of House Armed Services Committee Chairman Mike Rogers. Also on his committee is fellow Alabama Representative Dale Strong. As one studies the Republican membership of both the House and Senate Armed Services Committees, the list clearly includes a powerful block of Republican congressmen and senators from the U.S. Southeast, namely Joe Wilson of South Carolina, Austin Scott of Georgia, Trent Kelly of Mississippi, Matt Gaetz of Florida, Michael Waltz of Florida, Carlos Jimenez of Florida, Nancy Mace of South Carolina, Corey Mills of Florida, and Rich McCormick of Georgia. Meanwhile, the Senate Armed Services Committee includes another Alabama name, Tommy Tuberville, along with fellow Republicans ranking member Senator Roger Wicker of Mississippi and Rick Scott of Florida. An October 7, 2021 publication by John Glenn in the Energy Institute of Alabama newsletter quotes then Austal USA President Rusty Murdaugh's appreciation for Mr. Rogers' record of support for the company. Quote, "Congressman Rogers has been a champion of advancing our nation's military readiness through his career, and his support of Austal shipbuilding has been unwavering," Murdaugh said. Quote, "Austal USA, the builder of the Independence variant of the littoral combat ship and the expeditionary fast transport vessel, is also ready to increase its capacity should the Navy require it," said Craig, Percival, the company's president, according to the Congressional Research Service, citing a March 2017 press report. Quote, "The key thing for us is to keep the manufacturing lines hot and really leverage the momentum that we've gained on both of the programs," he said, according to the report. Austal has a 164-acre yard in Mobile, Alabama. The Navy earlier this year released a report stating 3 options for a naval force in a 30-year shipbuilding plan: 316 ships, or 327 ships, or 367 ships. According to the report, in June, the Navy sent Congress a classified report stating its true desire to build 373 ships. The reason that number was not publicly released is because of a dim reality: scarcity of money and shipyard capacity. Enter the once flourishing Guam shipyard repair facility. According to the Congressional Research Service's report, Navy force structure and shipbuilding plans, background, and issues for Congress. Shipbuilding and ship repair to keep a 31 amphibious ship fleet operational at any given time is non-negotiable, and the Marine Corps is ready to fight about it, the CSR report states.
Is this something that the AFC is doing or is thinking about doing, knocking on those doors in Washington, D.C.?
That's a discussion that's been ongoing for years. Yeah, that's not something new. That's something that when the ship repair facility actually pulled out, the discussions for getting it restarted began. So it's count the years when it left and to today, and then you'll know how long the Armed Forces Committee's been working on trying to get it back here in one form or another. The challenge you have is that there's somewhat of a technical challenge, because you're not repairing the same types of ships, you're not repairing the same types of materials, you're not repairing the same types of electronics. So you're calling for a different type of repair facility. Are you looking for a dry dock? And if you're looking for a dry dock, that's another totally separate question.
Or a floating dry dock.
Or a floating dry dock, but it's got to be a big one. If you were to go that route. But all of those questions have been discussed for years and years and years, and it's only, and Phil and Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, it's only recently that it's gotten a little more elevation, but not to the point of people saying there's going to be another dry dock.
We've been on that for years now, the Guam Chamber's Mr. Weber said, his colleague Mr. Sablan adding that the recommissioning of the Guam shipyard repair facility would cause an amazing boom in the economy. The continuously missing links to that reopening are the labor force to run it and the money to rebuild it. Money, like the kind Mr. Moylan has put his stamp of approval to flow to the southeastern United States.
Coming together. I can't answer your numbers question because I don't have any idea. But it's not surprising to me.
Okay. Any reactions on the congressman's admission that he signed off on this amendment?
Would have been nice if he told us. Yeah. If he were more candid about it, I think that would have been proper.
Following this report will be a second part focusing on the impacts of these actions on shipping, ship repair, and the Jones Act that affects Guam and Micronesia. For Kandit News, I'm Troy Torres. Good night.
Ilinala Ipalawan, Sinyabula, Minaletnya, Agan Bravo, Itatataunya.
Yet cervical cancer continues to pose a constant risk to women today due to low awareness.
Cervical cancer pasiye masek lanmatan sa kontilokinyaki. Fingom somono, pap smear, and HPV vaccination isa na kashing tilokinya.
Dapat ko rabil amla mugar. Ego mga laklangar rabil. Nagtamarera mo raw usong ala, yung raw gurula, ramak nitalak, raktel o maralir.
Ang mga babaeng may edad 21 pataas ay kailangang magpapaptest kada 3 taon.
Sa dating na sampartua, lari sa kwano, anana na token sila ng HPV.
Ewofisin, todo Guam Foundation, ato geriawak na test, may oposud, ewasemuet HPV. Erifefire sa rifirifit, iya patufit singeriare pagi, ekarin ni sakaw, dari tentugurut, nanabut, may apatsakurel fefil medicine, kirisam.
Tampakatilin cervical cancer arangan prevent na från avfekatjusarum movinial mahabugun kotafulaika cervical cancer.
Ara ko min matan fukokos.
Be a well woman.
Mga pakla ba din iyo?
Tufna kada pinipin ang raiwege da health rodat.
Piata li Caroline.
Dangin megat itataw tanya.
Maging malusog po tayong mga kababaihan.
Kitsvefi puede petiveteresi Torres sawal geririsi puede papatsakut. Take the first step to becoming a well woman and call Todu Guam Clinic today at 671-649-TODU to schedule an appointment.